All right, good morning, everyone. Make sure you can hear me. So if you cannot hear clearly, just let me know. Okay. All right, so what are we going to do today? So I'm going to spend a few minutes quickly review what we have discussed last class. In last class, we spent one lecture to explain economic growth. So I'm going to spend a few minutes quickly walking through what we learned and maybe expand a little bit in details what I think I have been skipped for like some like details, right? And then so after this review, we are going to move to a new chapter. So in that chapter, we are going to talk about labor market and talk about inflation, right? Okay, so let's see. So what do we have done? So in economic growth, so maybe use these slides to kind of summarize what we have discussed, right? So we start look at the some cross-country experience, right? So look at long-run economic growth experience. So basically, long-run economic growth was measured by real GDP per capita. Okay, so there are three things in this measurement. Number one, it is a GDP. Okay, so we have spent a chapter to explain what is GDP. And secondly, this must be per capita GDP and why this matters. So we actually will look at practice question. There was one country, it's a very hypothetical country, right? So this country experienced a 5% increase or 5% growth in aggregate GDP. But at the same time, this country experienced 5% population growth. So that just means, so the population growth will exactly opposite what we experience in terms of GDP growth or standard of living growth. It turns out there's nothing changed in terms of per capita term. So that's why we look at it per capita GDP, right? So now lastly, we need to look at real GDP. Okay. So again, so we have learned real GDP versus nominal GDP and how that matters. Just think about example. So we saw in the previous chapter, right? So if one country, nothing changed in terms of actual output, okay? But however, there's a significant change in price. If we look at nominal GDP, so this country feel like, oh, so this country has experiencing significant or phenomenal growth. But actually, so nothing changed in terms of their productivity. Nothing changed in terms of their standard of living. So that's why we measure long-run growth with real GDP per capita. Okay, just keep in mind. So there are three things inside this measurement, right? And we have seen, so this real GDP per capita has changed over time for most of countries. Think about in the United States from 1900 to 2010, right? So this has been increased from 100. So if we normalize 900 and go to around 780, right? Okay, that's for United States. But certainly, so this growth has been very different across countries, right? So just highlight a few countries. So we studied. So in China, in the time period from 1980 to now, so their growth rate is close to 8%. United States, the growth rate is close to 2%. And Argentina, as a bad example, so the growth rate is 0.88%. But there are countries worse than that, right? So we have seen African country, so they have growth rate of negative, below negative 1%, right? So those are the experience or those are the facts we have been seen by looking at same country across time and looking at same times across countries, okay? And then in the second part, so we look at what determines long-run economic growth. Okay, so long-run economic growth is measured by real per capita GDP, but essentially that's just productivity. What is productivity? Productivity is the output per worker. And then, so in the second part, we try to understand, so what can affect productivity? What is driving difference in productivity? And we sort out there are three things matters. Physical capital, use K, human capital, use H, and the technology use T, right? And then so we also study production function. So this production function essentially just gives you the relationship between productivity and these three factors, but in a mathematical way, right? Okay. Okay, so I can write down. So typically, this relationship looks like y equal to t times k. There is a factor there, and h. There's another factor there. Okay. And then next, so we try to understand what explains why long-run growth rate differs so much among countries. But certainly, this must link with those three things, right? It's either there's some difference in technology, or there's some difference in saving behavior that causes change in physical capital, or there's some difference in human capital related. Like we have one slide give you the case study comparing China versus Argentina, right? And so in Argentina, so yes, in absolute term, the average schooling is higher than China. But we look at history. So China, so closing the gap in the rapid way. So meaning, so they put a lot of resource or a lot of emphasis on the build of human capital through providing better education. So that's going to improve age. So that's also explains so why the growth rate is much higher. Okay. Okay, so now we move to the next one. That's convergence hypothesis. What is convergence hypothesis? Just say, for example, if we look at the United States versus Japan after World War II. So the war basically destroyed most of the capital, factory, infrastructure in Japan. And the US emerged as the superpower after war. Right? So they have quite a big gap in terms of their productivity after World War II. And this convergence hypothesis states, so the poorer the country, the higher the growth rate. That means eventually Japan will catch up with the United States. And we look at the data, it seems that it is the case. But this convergence hypothesis is not uniform or it's not universally true. In a sense, if you compare US versus Mexico, okay? So their gap stays, and the gap is going to stay for a long time to come. And why there is a gap or why this convergence hypothesis may fail is because, so if we compare US and Japan after World War II, the only difference between these two countries, or the only significant difference, is their income level or physical capital level. But if we compare US versus Mexico, so besides this physical capital difference or income difference, they also differ in terms of technology, differs in terms of institution, differs in terms of political system. So those things matters, right? Other things I want to highlight in this part is, so the reason why we have this convergence hypothesis among a select group of country, or the reason why a poor country typically grow faster is coming from decreasing return to physical capital, right? So the more physical capital you accumulate, the less additional income you're gonna get by investing a marginal amount. Right? So that translates into a richer the country, the lower the growth rate. That's also translates into the convergence. But when we talk about this convergence, literally we just keep this t and this h fixed. So now if you have one country, so it's catching up at the same times, they are changing t or h, so that's you're going to see a country keep growing instead of slowing down, as this convergence hypothesis says. Lastly, so we look at sustainability. So this is related to climate change. Whether you believe that or not, okay, if we look at the data, so this pollution or this carbon dioxide emission is happening, right? So it is going to have impact on our life, not for today, for future, and for our future generation. And this sustainability is about, so if we do our best to promote economic growth, okay, that our policy is going to damage our environment, that our policy is going to put some constraint on our resource or put some damage to our future generation. So that is about that, all right? So I have spent like 10 minutes to summarize what have we learned on Wednesday. Okay, so now let's just back to the new slides we're supposed to cover. So these slides. Okay, so this is a new chapter. Okay. So first, let me show you the roadmap of this chapter. Right. So this chapter is going to divide in two parts. Part number one, so we are going to look at labor market. Okay, so we are going to essentially, the goal is we need to understand unemployment. We need to understand the nature of unemployment, how to measure unemployment. And then in the second part, we are going to look at the relationship between unemployment growth and inflation. Right? So we are trying to understand so how inflation and unemployment they are linked to each other. And so in that sense, so you may understand so why we put these two concepts in one chapter. Okay, let me start with these slides. Okay. So in the background picture, so on the left-hand side, this gentleman, he is the chair of the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so you may not heard about the Federal Reserve. We will have one chapter to study what is Federal Reserve or Federal Reserve Bank System. Okay, so essentially the Federal Reserve Bank System in the United States is a central bank. But what is a central bank is a government agency. So that's going to regulate, that's going to monitor the financial market, financial system. So they are going to carry out their policy to maintain certain or to reach certain policy goal. But then what is their policy goal? So the Federal Reserve, so their goal has two. One is called price stability. The other is to satisfy the need of workers. Okay, so now we need to do some further explanation. So price stability, that essentially means they're going to maintain certain level of inflation. It cannot be too high, it cannot be too low. Okay, and but again, so in this chapter we are going to see so what happens if the inflation is too high, or what happens if inflation is too low, so that you understand so why they want to maintain a price stability. On the other hand, so they need to satisfy the need of workers. But what does the worker cares? The workers, they cares about jobs, right? So they cares about job stability. Okay? So they care about whether I can find a job. Okay? But then you're going to see, so this job stability and price stability, so they somehow interact each other. So that is why we put these two things in this chapter. Also, that is why, so the chair of the Federal Reserve, they do their best to balance the need of worker against the need for price stability, right? So that's how we start, right? So now we start, so in this chapter, let's start with a discussion on unemployment rate, right? So here I show you the unemployment rate for the US from 1948 to 2014, okay? So if you are interested, so you can look at more recent data, okay? But there are several things persist, or several things you should notice, okay? So number one, the most obvious things we can see from this graph is that unemployment rate fluctuates. Sometimes high, sometimes low. and they are just moving around between low and high, right? And we have time period, so the unemployment rate shoot up, like here, here, or maybe here. Okay, and then so we use this shaded area to highlight those time period unemployment rate went up. Okay, and actually we call this recession. Okay, so we have this is one recession. So we have roughly like 11 recessions after World War II. Okay, so recession basically is going to define as increasing unemployment rate. But you're going to see, so this naturally is coincided with a decline or contraction in consumption, in production. Number two, it is fluctuating. But however, interestingly, so over long run or long period of time. So this number, the average number is fairly high, and this has never below certain threshold. Right, so here is 0. And then never below 2, and most of the time it's probably just the lowest you can get for most of the time. The lowest that you can get is 4%, or in other words, there is a lower bound. There's a lower bound the unemployment rate can go. Okay. Now you may want to remind yourself what we have learned in the review of microeconomics. And what happens in any market in the long run. So in microeconomics, in the market, specifically we talk about market for soybeans or market for vehicles, for whatever market, right? So in the long run, supply must equal to demand. That's what happens in the long run, right? Supply equal to demand, meaning so the market is going to clear. Now, if we talk about labor market, supply equal to demand, meaning there will be no unemployment, or in other words, unemployment ratio equal to 0. But however, as you see from this figure, so this never happened. The best time we have seen is 1950, is still above 2%. For the rest of the time period we studied, it never below 4%. Right? So that's other things you want to keep in mind. Actually, this is what we call natural rate of unemployment. So what is natural rate of unemployment? So this is unemployment rate, so you will observe in the best day, which is certainly significantly above 0. Right? So those are the facts, so you want to keep in mind. But now, so you may wonder, so how we generate these numbers? How we can have a plot like this? Okay? So we need to understand some concept, and essentially we need to understand the labor market. Okay, we need to understand labor market. Right. So now let's see. So first, let's just look at a few definitions, and then so I'm going to explain to you the structure of labor market. Unemployment rate is a percentage of total number of people in labor force who are unemployed. Okay. But then, so what is labor force? Labor force includes all workers, employed or unemployed. Now another concept, labor force participation rate. So that is kind of give you a better understanding what does labor force means. So labor force participation rate gives you the percentage of adults. Who is considered adults? People 16 and over in the labor force. All right. Okay, so if you feel confused, don't worry. So I'm going to give you a virtualized representation of these characterizations. Right. So let's see, maybe just go back to here. All right. So let me just give you one more concept, and then I'll give you a virtualized representation. Okay. So here, so we have labor force participation rate. That is measuring the percent of adults. And just pay attention to this sentence, this part. Non-institutionalized civilian population who are working or actively looking for work. Okay, so how we understand this? So they just says, okay, so what is the population base for our discussion? For our discussion, the population base is adults who is non-institutionalized and who is also civilian. Okay, so that's our population base to talk about labor market. Now we are ready to look at a graphical representation. So let me draw a big pie. Okay, so this represents U.S. population. Okay, so the U.S. population is currently close to 300 million. So that's the U.S. population. But when we talk about labor market, so we are not going to look at this general concept. We are looking at adults, non-institutionalized civilian population. Or in other words, we look at a fraction of this pie. We are going to exclude probably 1/3. Okay, so this includes who? This includes people younger than 16, let's say 16 negative, or below 16. This first part. And secondly, so here, so include those people are institutionalized. Okay, so who is considered as institutionalized? So you think about those people who are in nursing home. Think about those people who have some mental disease. Or think about those people who are in prison. Right, so this is institutionalized. And the third, so these include those people are not considered as civilian. Those people in military. I just put non-civilian. Right? So there are 3 subgroups we put in this shady area. So that's not our discussion, or that's not the base for our discussion. Right? Our discussion is in the right part. So that is our, so this big one is called labor force, around 200 million. That's our, sorry, this is our adults population. Okay, in this adults population, so we have, let's use this. Okay. So we have majority, they are in labor force. And then so we have people not in labor force. Okay, to understand who are not in labor force, now we need to understand what does labor force participation means. So look at this definition, right? Labor force participation rate is a percentage of adult population. Okay, but we have constraint for those adult population who are working or actively looking for work. Okay, so this means, okay, if you want to be considered as labor force, either you are working, or we call employed, or you are looking for work, meaning you are unemployed. Okay. So this is how we understand the labor market. Right? So to summarize, we start with US population. And then we divide the US population into big categories. One is adult population, we cares. The other is non-adults, and those people are institutionalized, and there are people who are non-civilian. Okay, so now this adults population is going to represent by this part, this is adult population. So given this adult population, we further categorize between in labor force versus not in labor force. Okay, and then so among people who are in labor force, so we have people either have a job or who do not have a job or is looking for a job, right? So that is how we characterize labor market, right? So maybe just go back to previous slides to see those definitions one more time. Unemployment rate is a percentage of the total number of people in the labor force who are unemployed. Labor force, or workers, employed or unemployed. Labor force participation rate, the percentage of adults in the labor force. Right? So now back to this chart. Right? So what is labor force? Labor force is adult population who are employed or are looking for a job. Right? So this is labor force. And what is unemployment rate? Unemployment rate is a fraction of unemployed as in labor force. Right? Okay, so now we are ready to look at some examples and further concepts to better understand the labor market. Oh, by the way, so unemployment rate is the unemployed divided by the labor force. But labor force includes unemployed and employed. All right. Now, look at this practice question. In your country, there are 24 million people in the labor force. 21.5 are employed. What is the unemployment rate? Okay. And then use our definition. Unemployment rate equal to the number of unemployed divided by people in labor force. Right? But that's unemployed equal to what? Equal to labor force minus employed. Okay, so then so here, so the number of unemployed equal to 24 minus 21.5, and the labor force equal to 24. Right? So the answer is A. Okay. All right, so now we have just learned the structure of labor market. And we have just learned the unemployment rate. Okay. Now I want to emphasize unemployment rate is important and is a good indicator. It has been closely monitored by economists, by the government, like every week on Thursday morning. Okay? So the government will report the job number. And this job number has significant impact on stock market. Okay? But so it is important. However, so this unemployment rate only tells us part of the story, right? So it tells us how easy or how difficult to find a job. But it may overstate or understate the true level of the trouble in the labor market. Why is that? Okay. So it may overstate the true level of unemployment. Okay. This is because even labor market is healthy, but it takes time to find the right job. Right? Just think about a college graduate students, right? So it just takes you some time to sort out things, what you like, what you don't like. But during this time period, while you are searching, so you are characterized as unemployment, right? So in that sense, it overstates the true level of unemployment. On the other hand, it may understate the true level of unemployment. Why is that? Just remember, let's just focus on labor force. If this labor force, if this adult population, okay, And then so we have three categories. You have employed, you have unemployed, you have not in labor force. So what would happen if an unemployed person feel desperate or feel discouraged? They decide, so enough is enough. I'm not going to looking for a job anymore. I would rather stay at home, either take care of my kids or just spend on time on computer game, right? So that just means, okay, so now you have someone move from unemployed to not in labor force. But just remind yourself how we calculate unemployment rate. We use this number inside this small region to divide by the people in labor force, right? So now you can see, so the number of unemployed decreased. So the naturally, so this just leads to a smaller unemployment rate. But this doesn't tell you actually, so the economy is pretty bad, such that there are people who left labor force, they are discouraged. So in that sense, it can understate the true level of unemployment. Okay, to better understand the health of the labor market, okay, so beyond unemployment rate, so we may look at three other things. They are very important. Number one is called discouraged worker. Who is considered as discouraged worker? So those are non-working people who have given up looking for work for the time being. Right? So they are not considered unemployed because I haven't been looking for a job at all. Right? So the second is marginally attached worker. So those who were available and actively looking for work recently, but not currently looking. That just means technically, so they have been looking for a job during the past 12 months, but not in past 4 weeks. So you may be wondering, so how important is 4 weeks? So 4 weeks is just define you are active looking for a job, and that just define you are a unemployed. That means in the government number. So if you have not actively looking for a job during the past 4 weeks, you are not considered as unemployed. You are considered as not in labor force. Right? But however, so for those people who are not in labor force, so there are some who have been trying to looking for a job during past 12 months, right? So they are marginally attacked, but they are not show up in the number. Lastly, so we have underemployed. So those are people who work part-time because they cannot find full-time job. So they prefer to work as full-time, but unfortunately, so there's no full-time available. So in reality, particularly in the US labor market, so there are firms, they on purpose offer part-time job. So why they do that? So they just so that they can avoid paying their employee benefit, particularly the health benefit, which can cost quite a lot of money. All right. Now, given this in mind, so we can look at this diagram. Okay, so this is from 1994 to 2014. Okay, so we look at different numbers. We start in the bottom. In the very bottom is unemployment rate. Okay, but this unemployment rate only gives us a partial picture. So if we consider discouraged worker who quit looking for a job, okay, who is not in labor force, and then you can see this number increase, or you're going to see a worse picture regarding to labor market. Now, if we consider marginally attached worker who have tried looking for a job during last year, but not recently, and then so this picture become bleaker or even worse. Now, finally, so if we consider those people who involuntarily work as part-time, and then it's probably get even worse. Okay, and if you stare at this picture, you're going to see, so during the crisis, particularly the 2008-2009 crisis. Okay, so the gap between the conventional unemployment rate or the standard unemployment rate number with those three things we discussed, you can see the gap widening, right? So this actually typically happens in recession. So during the recession, or the deeper the recession, there are more discouraged workers. There are more marginal attached workers. There are more involuntary part-time workers. Or in other words, the deeper the recession, the less useful to only look at unemployment rate. All right. So as usual, so let's just take a few minutes break. So during the break time, so I'm going to let you watch a video. And once we come back, once we're done with video, and then so we are going to continue with this practice question. All right. So let me just switch my computer.